Welcome to episode 196 of the Intercooler podcast with me, Dan Prosser, Andrew Frankel, my co-host, and a returning guest this week, Mr. Richard Bremner. Richard, thank you for joining us again. Now, we're getting you back on the podcast because a few weeks ago, it was episode 191, for anyone who wants to go back. You came on and we discussed British Motor Corporation, or British Leyland, Rover. And we sort of did a bit of a deep dive into that whole saga. It was a reasonably lengthy episode, but there's only so much you can say even in an hour and 20 minutes. We wanted to get you back on, in part to cover a little bit of ground that we didn't get onto last time, but actually the bulk of this episode is going to be talking about your cars, not least because you've got a handful of British Leyland stuff that you can tell us about in all its grisly detail. But I mean, we had a really good response to the first episode that we did with you. People, it seems, really enjoyed listening to the tale of BL. I don't think we really covered the sort of demise, the final few years. What do we need to say about that? I mean, how spectacularly wrong did it all go, and why?
Yeah, and also, was it always doomed from the moment BMW offloaded it?
Yeah.
Was it only ever going to be a question of time, or do you think that had it been properly handled, there could have been a future?
Yes. So when BMW offloaded it, it was very likely that the outcome that we got would transpire. It's very difficult for what had suddenly become a tiny car manufacturer with a very old product range, apart from the Rover 75, and insufficient financial backing to survive. I would say it wasn't impossible, and what they needed was a partner, which they tried to get with increasing zeal towards the end, or to do some sort of collaborative deal.
Do we know who they were talking to?
Well, the ones they publicized were initially China Brilliance, and that ultimately fell through, and then Shanghai Automotive Industries Corporation, who of course now own MG. And when they first started talking, SAIC, as they're more widely known in Britain at any rate, were looking to actually buy it as a going concern. But maybe they realized that they might be able to get it for far less money and with far less in the way of obligation, if you like, to pension funds or keeping people employed and so on, if they waited for it to go broke. That is only speculation on my part. I don't know whether that was actually a deliberate plan. But before that, I believe there were efforts to at least collaborate. So I know, for example, that Fiat were interested in them perhaps taking advantage of the failure, if you like, of the Fiat Stilo, which was a Golf competitor nominally, and a very unsuccessful car, really.
Deservedly unsuccessful.
And the upshot of it being so unsuccessful was that they had a lot of spare capacity, and they also had a platform that maybe Rover could have used. Anyway, one can speculate on how that might have worked, but obviously it didn't come to anything. There might have been other conversations, but I don't know about them. Okay. It was astonishing, some of the things that went on in those last 4.5 years. Some things were pretty sensible or almost shrewd, given the position they were in. So they deserve credit for producing MG versions of all the Rovers. So the 25, 45 and 75.
And they were good, weren't they?
They became the ZR, the ZS and the ZT, didn't they?
Yeah, they became the ZR, ZS, and ZT. And obviously, you can accuse them yet again of cynical badge engineering. But the difference with these cars was that the chassis were really well
They
developed.
were.
And a chap called Rob Oldacre, who was heavily involved with that, probably drove that through. I mean, he was a racer and he had been a Bentley development engineer, and then he previously worked at Rover. So he knew a lot about chassis development. I'm sure there were many other people involved with it, but the result was cars that actually did stack up. And in fact, for a brief period before the 2001 Mini came out, the MGZR, the smallest of them, was the best-selling hot hatch in the UK.
Wow.
Not least because they cleverly offered it with low-power engines, which may sound counterintuitive, but the point was that young people could then insure it.
Yeah.
So there were very
I
few.
was I was 16, 17, I think, when those cars were knocking about, and to someone my age, they were super desirable. It didn't matter that it was a Rover 25, really. You know, it looked cool. They came in bright colours. They had, I think,
They were all
multi-spoke
yellow,
wheels.
weren't they?
Yeah,
So many of them were yellow. Yeah, they were cool.
Yeah.
they had sporty body kits.
Yeah.
They seemed pretty good to drive. And then the ZS, the bigger one, there was a hatch and a saloon, wasn't there? My uncle had one of each, both with the V6.
Wow.
180 horsepower V6.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds great now, doesn't
Yeah.
it? A small saloon, V6 engine, proper sporting
Yeah.
chassis.
Well,
Fantastic.
of the three, that was actually the best handling of the lot.
Yeah, my
Because,
uncle still stuck one of them through a hedge backwards at speed.
well,
Says more about him, I think.
yeah. But because it had, I think, double wishbones at the front, because it was essentially a Honda, and so it was more tunable than the other two, which had McPherson struts at the front. So it was a really well balanced car, despite a bit V6 up front, but it was a lightweight, relatively speaking, V6. So it had a pretty horrible dashboard, but it was actually the best of the three to drive as a V6.
When can we get
Anyway.
on to the one with the proper engine in it?
And then, yes, this is where the madness starts.
The brilliant
Having-
madness. The
If you like,
total
scored a
glorious
hat-trick
insanity.
Well, yeah, scored a hat trick with those three. They then thought, why don't we build a V8 powered Rover 75 or MGZT? And so the idea was to put an off the shelf Ford, I think 4.6 litre V8, the Mustang engine in the car. But in order to do that, you had to convert it from front wheel drive to rear, which is, you're almost re engineering half the underside of the car, and or more than that, really.
That is an enormous undertaking for any manufacturer.
Yeah, well, in fact, the only manufacturer I'm aware of that has ever done that before is, guess, British Leyland, when the Triumph 1300, which was a very good car in 1966, was converted to rear-wheel drive to become the Triumph Toledo and ultimately the Dolomite and Dolomite Sprint. Actually, quite a successful conversion.
Yeah.
Because they sold quite a lot of those cars, but on the face of it, madness. In the case of the ZT, however, they basically gave the contractor to develop it to ProDrive, a good choice. But I don't know what it cost, but it would be far in excess of just under the profits. Well, there weren't any profits, but the nominal profits on just under 1,000 cars.
That's
built.
madness.
Does that include, because there was an estate and there was a Rover, wasn't there? There was a Rover 75 V8.
Yeah, there was towards the end there was a Rover version with a different nose with a sort of Audi-esque grille.
Yeah.
And you could only have that with an automatic transmission. I think it was a 3-speed or a 4-speed, but quite a crude box. I mean, the fuel consumption would have been appalling. But in fact, the MG version really drove very well, and
it was absolutely hilarious. I can remember driving one around Mallory Park in the wet, chasing Anthony Reid. And basically, the limiting factor was just how much laughing you were doing, because you could literally have laughed yourself off the track. It would go, basically, you just sort of tip it into a corner, then turn the steering wheel as far as you possibly could in the opposite direction, and then just wait for events to develop. It was, I mean, it was pretty rubbish. I can remember there's nowhere, because it had that massive transmission in it, which was never designed to have. There was basically nowhere to put your left foot. And it had all sorts of other issues, but just as a thing to get in and hoon about, it was a right laugh.
Yeah. I mean, there's a pretty keen club for them, which is a good thing, because backup for those it's there, but not the easiest thing to keep on the road. But I mean, their values hold pretty well, and I'm quite sure that that will be a proper classic if it isn't already.
I'm amazed, Richard, you don't already have one in one of your mini sheds. I bet you're tempted.
Well, there's still time.
Early days.
Did you say 1,000 cars?
Yeah, I think it's 991.
Blimey.
But I need to check that. But yeah.
All that effort.
And I would imagine the survival rate is fairly high, even though I witnessed one being rolled on the autocar handling.
I've seen the video.
By, I won't name him.
It wasn't me.
Lotus.
Yeah, the footage is quite dramatic, isn't it? I have seen
that. So if you thought that was mad, it wasn't as mad as suddenly deciding to try to make a supercar or something approaching it.
Oh my God, I forgot.
No, I did not.
The rights to a De Tomaso car whose name has gone out of my head, and re-engineering it. Again with a V8.
Wasn't there a company called Kvail involved in it? QVALE.
I think they were slightly. But yes, they produced this carbon-bodied rear-wheel drive V8 coupe called the MG-SV. And so quite a chunk of it was made in Italy, in Turin. In fact, the quality of the carbon fiber body was extraordinarily good, better than a lot of big names were producing at the time. But they, must have spent millions redeveloping this car, which hadn't been developed enough. Sorry, Andrew.
Did Peter Stevens style it, or have I
just?
Did. Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
because it was a good-looking thing, I thought.
Yeah, I thought less so.
Okay, fair enough.
There was an Italian development engineer who'd come from De Tomaso who worked on it at Longbridge, and he came up with this wonderful line, which was, "It will aggress you," which I think absolutely summed it up. And so anyway, there's a rumor that, in fact, they never actually sold one of them properly as a sort of genuine retail sale. Obviously, several of them were sold in the end. And I think some owners have sort of finished the development off. But,
yeah. And what was the difference? Because there were two, weren't there? There was an SV and there was an SVR. And I think the SVR must have just had a pokier engine in it.
I think so.
And I can't even remember which one I drove because it was a while back. I do remember it wasn't terribly good. And it was, when it was new, it was enormously expensive, wasn't it?
It was, understandably in a way, because of the, just the carbon body was.
Yeah, but the problem was that they were somehow expecting people to spend Ferrari money on something with an MG badge, and that was, it was never going to happen, was it?
That's one problem. We haven't got time to list all the others, I would say.
No, you're right though, because why would they go off and try and do something like that when there's a business to be salvaged?
Well, I think we're jumping ahead here, but just briefly, I mean, there was a feeling when the whole thing collapsed that the management had just thought, well, this is never going to work. We might as well have a bit of fun while we still can, and various pet projects were pursued. Another one being running in Le Mans with an MG Lola, which in fact you mentioned Anthony Reid. He was in one of the teams.
And it was a very quick. I was there one year in the wet at night. It was the quickest car on the circuit.
under MG colours, as it were, twice, I think, at Le Mans. And it was, as you say, it was very quick and a very promising car. It wasn't beyond the bounds of possibility that it could have won its class, I think.
But that's the point. It was in the sort of the junior, I guess we'd now call LMP2 class.
That's right. Yeah.
I can't remember what they would have called it at the time, but it was a 675 kilo car.
Yeah.
With limited power, and all the big boys were in the 900 kilo, what we call LMP1 category now. But as I said, in the wet at night, it was quicker, not just than everything else in its class, but anything else on the track. It had. You talked to Anthony Reid about it. The car had the most enormous potential, but from memory, it just kept on breaking, didn't it? It just didn't have the endurance.
Yeah, it hadn't had enough development, but yes, they could have done extremely well with it. But I don't know. Would that have sold more MGZs? I don't know. It might have done. But again, it's just a complete distraction from the basic problem, which was that they were trying to produce a serious new car, the almost mythical new medium car, as it was called. So that was going to replace the Rover 45, which was the most aged of the three, and the most sensible, I would say, in product planning terms, to try to replace. And that may be where, conversations with Fiat and others, may have come about. But in the end, they decided to try and use a cut down and cost reduced Rover 75 platform, which in principle is good, could be good, because the 75 platform was and is very good, but it's very hard to cut weight and cost out of something like that without severely compromising it, or just not being able to get to where you need to be in terms of packaging, say. And they never really had the money to even to engineer that. You might recall the Peter Stevens design team Rover TCV, I think it was, the concept car shown at Geneva, which was sort of close to the end of MG Rover's life, but it had a washing machine on display in the boot, to try to get over the fact that despite being an MG, I think it was presented as it was a Rover, but it was quite sporty looking, that it was practical as well. But I have to say, I thought it was pretty ugly. And yeah, it never happened. So in the end, they just ran out of money. I think they were selling every car at a loss. They owed their suppliers money, and eventually one of the suppliers put their hands up and said, "We're not going to send you parts anymore. We can't carry on accumulating debt, waiting for you to pay." And really, that's like taking the block out of the Jenga pile that pulls the tower down. You can't build a car without whatever bit it was. I think it might have been bumpers that they were going to stop supplying, but it doesn't matter what it was, really. It was a key part.
There was
the whole thing unraveled then.
There was, at the time, we have to be careful what we say, but there were all sorts of suggestions that this was more than just sort of bad management, that there was actually some fairly not great stuff going on amongst the senior management, and that their motives were not as pure as they might have suggested in public. Is there something in that? Was it actually all a bit dodge, or was it just people trying really, really hard with limited resources and just ran out of time?
I think it was a bit of both, weirdly. I don't think it was, I can't remember. I don't think it was definitively proven, but there were suggestions that there had been quite a bit of nest feathering, if you like.
Indeed.
But I do know certainly some, if not all, of the Phoenix Four worked incredibly hard to try to pull off a deal that would save the business. And China probably was the best bet, because it was a much more embryonic business industry 20 odd years ago. and there were attractions um, in buying into MG Rover for China, and indeed that's exactly what happened in the end after it went under.
Yeah.
But by that point there were so few assets left. They'd mortgaged the plant and the land it was on. They used up nearly every possible asset they had to try to keep it going. It was like playing a Monopoly hand when you've only got £5 left and you're just hoping you don't land on Mayfair.
Yeah,
that's where they got to.
I did a week's work experience at MG Rover, as it was in those last couple of years.
Right.
I must have been still in school, so I was probably 15 or something. Because at that time I thought I'd like to be a car designer, and so I worked my way into a week at MG Rover, and of course found myself in the engineering department rather than design. And just do you know, I don't really remember a great deal of being there or what I got up to, but I soon changed my mind about what I wanted to do with my working life. I decided to go write about cars instead. But it was a curious place back then. I think the whole thing collapsed a year or two later.
Yeah, I mean, I had a slightly strange experience in that, talking of the MGSV, I did a story where we drove one back from Italy, sort of mimicking those supercar stories, but with the point of going to see the place where they made the carbon bodies and talking to people in Italy who were involved with the making and development of it. And then I drove it back to Longbridge. It turned out the car had been crashed the week before and the suspension geometry was out and hadn't been fixed, unbeknown to the press office in their defense. And so it drove even less well than they normally do. But anyway, when I got back there, as it turned out, it was a week to go before the thing collapsed. And I remember just feeling there was an odd atmosphere there. I couldn't pin it down, and I thought it was odd to be feeling that, really. But yeah, as it turned out, it was running out of road. But yes, I mean, that my view, yes, it was inevitable, really, unless they could have pulled off some stellar deal, which was, the odds were against them. But I think the tragedy was that it became so difficult for BMW to carry on. I remember thinking when they bought the whole lot, MG Rover or Rover Group, including Land Rover in 1994, that there couldn't have been a better manufacturer to take it over, because they understood brands and they were well resourced and they were an engineering company, as much as a design and marketing company. And it all got off to quite a good start, and there isn't time to get into the detail of that. But the Rover 75, I realise I'm aware I'm a big fan of this car, but one of the reasons for that is that it was the first sort of Rover product, or Austin Rover product, BL product, whatever you care to call it, that really was properly engineered for decades, almost, and a car that never really was appreciated properly when it was on sale. And it was simply a demonstration of what might have been possible, as was the L322 Range Rover that BMW and Rover, or Land Rover, engineered. Not the most reliable vehicle, it has to be said, but a fantastic rebirth of the Range Rover, and show you what the potential was.
So is this a good time then to move the conversation onto your cars, your BL cars? Because
absolutely, yeah.
Because you have a 75, don't you?
I do, yeah. It's the second one I've owned, and the first one was unexpectedly, I would say, in terms of value for money, reliability, and enjoyment per pound, is the best car I've ever owned.
Wow.
Not least because it cost £800.
Yeah.
It was underpriced, I realised eventually, on Auto Trader, and it was a top of the range Connoisseur SE with
A connoisseur.
pretty much every toy you could get on them, down to a sort of electric rear window blind, just what you need in Britain. And in fact, I turned up to look at this car with a mate, and the dealer turned out to be some guys operating out of a shipping container on an abandoned petrol station site. And they had
Sounds
about 20
totally
cars.
legit, entirely above board. Just before we sort of get into that, can we just sort of, just because I know a little bit about your car collecting backstory, can we just sort of establish the credential? Because you're a man who worked at British Leyland, and you're obviously a man who knows an awful lot about what went on there. But you've kind of put your money where your mouth is, haven't you? Because more than anybody else I know, you have accumulated British Leyland product. How many BL, BMC cars do you think you have owned, and how many do you own now?
Well, as a result of you asking me about this, I made a list, and I was astonished to discover that I have owned 23 cars under this umbrella, of which I still have 6. Yeah.
What was the first?
So I would never have said that I own that many, but yes, I have. So
where did it all start? And also, can you just, I mean, obviously you've got a personal connection to it because you work there and everything else, but I think that there will be, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but quite a few people listening to this thinking, why on earth has he decided to own and collect so many cars from a company whose history is best described as checkered and whose product have at times fallen somewhat short of the mark, some might say.
Indeed, yeah. Well, why have I bought some of these cars? Well, because I touched on this in the last podcast we did, but the reason I wanted to work for BL was because I felt they made the most interesting cars in Britain compared to Ford, Chrysler, and Vauxhall, which all made very conventional cars. They were the only one of those 4 usually to make anything technically or in design terms daring, like the Rover SD1. I mean, there's a long list of technically very interesting cars that they've made, often underdeveloped, which is why many of them got a bad reputation. But what I admired was the willingness to try something new that would hopefully be better. Whereas the chances back then in the 70s and 80s of getting something like that out of Ford was close to nil. I mean, in the end, Ford became makers of some of the best volume cars in Europe.
But that was after, wasn't it? A long time.
But that was after.
Yeah.
And so some of these cars I've been curious about, but the car I've owned the most examples of, I discovered, is the Austin Allegro, which is ludicrous, really. But,
it makes sense.
Yeah, but the thing is that when I was 15, just 15 when that car came out, and by then I'd become really quite obsessed with BL because of the Mini. That was what started my interest, as it did for tens of thousands of car enthusiasts.
Absolutely.
Because the Mini made such an impact for all the reasons we know. So I was very hopeful when the Allegro was on the brink of coming out that this car was going to, start to turn them around. And then when it actually appeared,
it didn't.
Doubts set in, even though it did move on their fluid suspension technology with hydrogas rather than hydroelastic. But anyway, as we all know, it wasn't as good a car as it should have been.
Nevertheless, how many have you had?
I have had 5.
5. Okay.
There must be support groups.
Okay, so have you had an Allegro with a square steering wheel?
I have.
You've had it with a Cortex steering wheel?
I have.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Have you had a Vanden Plas?
No, nor will I ever. I think it's a daft thing to be saying, but it's so ugly.
So a Vanden Plas, for those who are not familiar with mid 1970s Allegros, was, I mean, it was basically, it was, I mean, it's so terrible because in Vanden Plas, for people who know anything about sort of coach building before the war, they were up there with the best of the most prestigious coach builders. It's where you took your Bentley to have, you know, the raciest Le Mans body put on it, and it became a sort of a badge on the back of an Allegro with an appalling fake radiator on the front, and what was it, just sort of bits of walnut inside and velour and added plushness.
Well, I can't believe I'm mounting a defence of this car, but I'm going to. What you've got to recall, well, even though it's before your time, is that there was the predecessor to that model was the. In fact, they were never called Austin 1100, or it wasn't, Allegro wasn't in the name of it. It was the car that started this was the Princess 1100, which was a Austin Morris 1100 finished by Vanden Plas, and it really was, in that a part finished 1100 would be dispatched to the Vanden Plas.
This is sorry to interrupt. This is not the Princess that came later.
No. This is the small, 1100 1300,
exactly,
which came out in 1962 and was Britain's best-selling car for 10 years.
Yeah.
It's the car that the estate version of which Basil Fawlty thrashes with a branch for its failure to start.
Yeah.
For the 95th time. And so somebody had the idea that there might be a market for a very well finished and appointed small car that might suit people who had previously had a Jaguar, retired, and wanted the same luxury ambience inside, but in a much smaller package. So whilst the car obviously wasn't coach built because it was bodily almost identical, save for the grille, the interior had Connolly leather, real walnut, West of England cloth headlining, high quality carpets. So it really was high quality materials used in it, and extra soundproofing. So it was quite refined. And back then, when it came out, 63 or 64, it was a really unusual idea, and it sold very well. Many of them were automatics because they were bought by people who had got bored with changing gear. And so it made sense on paper to do the same with the Allegro. But whoever styled that, and styled is too generous a term, that grille on the front end, giving a pig ugly car a snout, should have been made to live with it for the rest of their lives. But the funny thing is that it sold quite well and with a massive margin. So it was very profitable. And in fact, the first, and as Allegro wasn't in the name, it was called the Vanden Plas 1500. The first of them were also finished at the Kingsbury Works in London, and you know, to the pretty much the same standard as its predecessor. So yeah, I don't know how we got onto that. Yeah, no, I've never owned one.
Entirely my fault. Okay, we are as ever. Time presses onward, so we're going to have to rattle through a few more. What was the very first BL car that you owned?
Well, I bought with a friend a non-running Daimler 250 V8.
Wow.
For £100 from a colleague.
That's brave.
It was brave and stupid in that we had no money, no facilities, no skill with which to fix it up.
So again, a Daimler V8 it's basically the Daimler version of the Inspector Morse Mark II, very famous.
That's right.
As well by bank robbers all
the
over
Jaguar,
the world.
Yeah. But with a lovely V8, although I never heard it run. But anyway, about a year later, having paid for it to sit rusting in a lockup, we had to face facts, and we sold it for £100. So basically, we just shelled out for storage to no end. And that was while I was still at BL, but rather, or in fact, decidedly disloyal was the fact that while I worked at BL, I never actually owned a BL car. And that was, well, for a number of stupid reasons, but one of them was in my naive enthusiasm for the company building a better car. I thought I would only drive a car that appeared in the interesting section of car magazines, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And unfortunately, nothing that BL made appeared in the interesting section I could remotely afford. So while I should have been driving a Mini or an 1100, I actually drove a Renault 4 and then a Simca 1100 after that. And then at one point, I bought an absolutely wrecked but running Alpha 1750 GTV, which started me off down another avenue over my car buying life. And I remember driving to work in it not long after I got it, and a colleague came up to me as I parked it, and he said, "I admire your taste, but not your loyalty." Which, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so
throw some more at us.
Yeah, what have been the highlights?
I didn't buy anything BL for quite a while. I think what really tipped me into it was a colleague who you might recall, Andrew, called Russell Hayes, who I worked with on 4Car for a while, and he pointed out that, you know, for the price of I don't know, a decent Lotus, you could buy almost the entire showroom of BL cars from the 1970s, and you know, Princess, Allegro, Marina, what have you. And unfortunately, that idea didn't leave me, and I proceeded to live the dream.
So let me fire some cars at you, and you tell me whether you own them or not. You just mentioned what, Marina?
No.
On principle?
I mean, it obviously had little going for it, but no, I've never owned one, although I have a curious... I would quite like to own a 1.8 TC, which had an MGB engine and was dynamically incapable of handling the power, which today I think we would all find a very entertaining car, given how homogenized modern cars are. But I've never had one of those.
What, a Stag?
No, not that they're trouble-free, but it's a bit too much of a cruiser somehow. Never quite appealed.
Maxi?
Pretty though it is. Sorry?
A Maxi?
No, my mum had one, and I think that was enough. Although I admire many things about it.
5-speed
It
gearbox.
also did quite well in the London to Mexico rally. But yes, no, I haven't had one of those.
So what have been the highlights then of the the BL cars that you have owned?
I've got a Princess, a 1977 Wedge.
I've driven it.
Which you've driven, Andrew, briefly, because it broke down, although it was entirely my fault that it broke down. And that car was sort of, tends to be bracketed with the Allegro Marina as a sort of glorious failure, but in fact, it really was a good car. And in comparison tests of the day, when it might be pitted against, say, a Citroen CX, which, you know, was a really good car, it would be very close to beating it.
It's incredibly comfortable.
So it was absolutely competitive, and it's what's unusual about it, apart from the styling, which I think is one of Harris Mann, who designed it, his more successful designs, and certainly bold. It's got a fantastic ride. Its refinement is a lot greater than you would expect for a lesser executive car of the time. Mine is a 6-cylinder, transverse 6-cylinder. It's a super smooth engine.
We were trying to think. Was it having a conversation with you about another car with a transverse 6-cylinder in its nose?
I think there was a Volvo.
There was an S80, wasn't there, or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredibly hard thing to achieve for those mad enough to want to achieve it, because the length of the engine and then the gearbox on the end, fitting that between the wheel arches and still having a decent turning circle is extremely difficult. So in the case of the Princess and the Austin 2200 Land Crab that came before it, which also had that powertrain, you end up compromising the design of the cylinder head in order to make the engine short enough to fit. Gotcha. So it was difficult to get more power out of it than it already had, which was a whacking 110 horsepower, but more torque, in more than 110 pounds-foot of torque. But so it's not slow. Yeah, but I just love its individuality and the bravery of it. And one of the things its predecessor was criticised for, and rightly, was pig ugly styling. It was called the land crab because it resembled one of those scuttling creatures across a beach.
Yeah.
And but had a lot going for it technically. And the Princess, or 1822 series, as it was called when it came out, turned that on its head. I mean, it's an utterly startling looking car and absolutely on trend for the mid 1970s.
Talking of startling looking cars, I know you have one of these because I've driven that too. You have a TR7.
I did.
You got rid of it?
Sold it in the end. But,
okay.
Yes, so this was, I guess, on the same theme of realizing that you could acquire a showroom's worth of cars for the price of a new one. I bought this TR7 fixed head coupe, which to most people would be the ugly one, but to me, I think, well, that's the version with the most startling styling, with its flat rear windscreen and turret top. And it's actually structurally a very rigid car, or it is before it's started corroding anyway. And this one had done, I don't know, 11,000 miles from new.
Yeah.
And it was for sale because the chap selling it, I felt sorry for him. He couldn't get out of it very easily anymore. So he was at risk of his getting in a car and it would be a one-way trip. So he sold it. I paid 3,000 quid for an 11,000 mile TR7,
wow,
which had no rust on it. And it's a funny car. I mean, as it was when it was new, it has a fantastic dashboard design. Even by today's standard, it's incredibly well laid out and modern looking. Less so now with digital dashes, but it was for a while. Very comfortable car, very good ride. And these are all things you wouldn't necessarily prioritize in a sports car. But on the other hand, it had a pretty gruff engine that didn't like to rev. The short wheelbase meant that it sort of pitched when you accelerated and dived when you braked, especially because the suspension was soft. It handled quite well, but there was always a danger it would tip you into a sudden spin. And yeah, in the end, I just thought, I think I've done this.
Do you still
and sold it?
Do you still have? I think one of the most underrated cars, and I think we did touch on this a bit in the previous podcast we did with you, was the original Maestro, because I think when that came out in 1980, I think that was a world-class product.
It was very competitive. So I bought a 1980 Maestro, which I saw on the verge in a village when I was driving to Goodwood. For a brief while, I was involved with the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and I was going to a creative committee meeting, and I saw it on the way. And when I got there, a colleague, Gary Axon, who's also massively into oddball cars, had also spotted this car for sale. And what we ended up talking about was the fact that we both knew it was a very early one, because the rear wipers washer jet on the very early Maestros is mounted below the rear screen, which, when you think about it, gives the pump a lot of work to do to push the water uphill, as it were. So after a few months, they moved to the top of the tailgate.
It was the location of the washer nozzle that you knew that meant it had to be an early one.
Indeed.
That's quite a level of knowledge. That is quite a level of knowledge.
Yeah. of the old disease, and indeed similarly afflicting Gary Axon. But and anyway, I got to this meeting, and Gary was moderately interested in it, and somebody else we know, Erin Baker, who was then with the Telegraph, was also, when she heard about it, interested in it because she'd learned to drive on one. Anyway, I bought it for 225 quid. And I think it had done 27,000 miles. It was a 1 litre L in hearing aid beige with,
of course,
paprika, as in the spice, interior. I mean, quite a striking colour combo. And I ended up spending a bit of money on bodywork. It wasn't too bad, but and had it for a while. And then I sold it to another journalist colleague, Jamie Kitman, who lives in New York. And so I ended up driving this Metro to Southampton docks, and I was instructed to park it next to all these brand new Range Rovers, Jags and Minis that were being shipped to the States, and along with this forlorn beige Metro. Yes, when Jamie Kitman went to pick it up, he emailed me and said, "What tools do I need to bring to get it to go?" And I said, "Well, it should be fine." And in fact, it started first time.
There you go.
And a couple of days later, he sent me a picture of it outside a New York nightclub parked next to an enormous Cadillac Escalade. Anyway, he kept it for quite a few years and wrote about it in various magazines. And then he passed it on to his son, Ike, who kept it for a few years, and now it is with a BL enthusiast somewhere in the US. And it's probably the most famous Metro in America, and indeed the only.
How many can there be
in America?
So we are running out of time. Can you just quickly give us a list of the handful of BL cars that you have at the moment?
So the ones I've got now are the Princess. I've kept that. An Austin 1300 GT, which is the least slow version of the 1100 1300 series. And this is I mean, they tarted it up basically in a late 60s style. So it had a vinyl roof, mock alloy wheels, and a sort of racy silver and black metal strip running down the sides. But also, what it also had was an engine almost identical to a Mini Cooper S's. And this package they announced in the advert as the one GT that just had to be.
Wow.
And back then there weren't many fake GTs. You know, most of them really were Ferraris. So absurd on one level, but it actually sold very well. I mean, it's quite a fun thing to drive, as you will hopefully find out one day, Andrew. But yeah. So my dad had one, and you know, lots of stupid nostalgic reasons for having one. So I've got that. I have Maestro, and the reason I have one of those is that I actually, in the tiniest way, worked on that before it was launched in product marketing.
Does it talk to you?
You might or might not remember that the Maestro was famous or infamous for having on the top models a so-called digital dashboard. Yeah. So it had digital instruments and also a voice synthesizer. So a voice would issue warnings, not warning guarantee about to expire, but things like warning handbrake on. And to my amazement back then, my boss and I were tasked with finding a voice to announce these assorted warnings. So my boss got a cassette tape from an agency with various actors and actresses enunciating on it, and we picked a woman called Nicolette Mackenzie. And I guess to the credit of our colleagues, no one said, "Why have you picked a woman?" Not one question about that. And anyway, yeah, so that was one of my tiny half contributions to the Maestro. Anyway, I came across one of these cars with the digital dash, well, quite a few years ago now, for 900 quid, 26,000 miles. I just couldn't resist it.
So, and does Nicolette still talk to you?
It will still talk. Yeah, it all
Have you
works.
been in touch with her recently? Do we know what happened to Nicolette?
Well, the thing is, she has actually been interviewed by a number of our colleagues over the years because of her
A
starring
starring
role
role.
in the dashboard of the Maestro, much to her amazement. But I've never actually met her or interviewed her. I believe she's still around. I'm not sure how much damage that career move did to her, but, but yes, all that stuff still works.
Wow.
Uh, 35 years later.
What else?
What else do I have? I still have a Rover 75, as mentioned.
Yep.
I have a
You're having to look at a piece of paper,
BMW.
aren't you? I can tell. You can't remember how many BL cars you've got.
Well, I have to look. I'm looking at a list now, Andrew. So I've got a 2001 Mini Cooper.
Oh, cool.
Which is obviously a BMW era product, but
Yeah.
it was co-developed by BMW and Rover.
That counts.
And the reason I've got it is you might have heard of the Y-Reg Mini Club.
Yeah.
And basically, the new Mini went on sale in July 2001. That was the year in which there was a massive number plate change, and we went from Y-Reg to a 51 plate, which meant that nearly all the private buyers wanting a brand new Mini, which was a very sought after car, waited until September the 1st when the new plate came in. The upshot being that nearly all the Y-Reg Minis were registered by BMW Group or their dealer network, because no private individual was going to register on a Y. So there are very few of them, and by definition, they're all low chassis number cars, and there's a club for them.
Do we know how many there are?
Well, what constitutes a low chassis number? Where does it end? Is it up to 1,000? I don't know, but mine is 155. But there are a lot. There are about 60 or 70, 80 even that are lower than that. I think because the first 60 odd they deemed not quite fit for sale and used them for crash test or development work or whatever. So I don't know, it's from around chassis number 62, say. I'm sure I'll be corrected on this, but they started to be retailed. So they have a following and a value, but rather like the original Mini, the very early Mini, BMW era Minis have a few features that were only on the very early cars, which makes them more collectible. I mean, it was amazing, I felt, how it echoed the original car in that regard. I guess that's what attracted me to buying one.
By my count, do you have one more? Is there one more on your
I've
list?
got a Jaguar XJ40, which is the most recent acquisition. And that, why did I buy one of those? I was there for the launch. I was involved at Car Magazine with interviewing a lot of the people involved with it. I was just sort of fascinated by what they tried to achieve. And weirdly, that car had a semi-digital dash, which is not really a very nice thing to look at, but it's just interesting.
So which one have you got?
Well, it's not a prime choice in a way, because it's a 2.9 auto, and this is the version that Norman Dewis, Jaguar's own development driver, said to the management, do we really have to launch this version? Or words to that effect, because it was just too slow. It's only got 165 horsepower, but it was done for tax reasons, so Italy and one or two other mainland Europe markets, but also it meant that it was an entry-level model that overlapped the top end of the Granada Scorpio and Rover 800 range.
And yours doesn't have the digital dash?
It does.
It does.
That's the point. It's a 2.9 with a digital dash. It's a sovereign, so it's the higher trim level with sort of inlaid wood and quite a lot of other electric seats and sunroof. And so it's very well equipped. And you basically have a lot of time to enjoy all that because it's not very fast. But what drew me to it, and I had no plans to buy one on the day in question, I went to an auction faithfully with a mate, and this car has done 12,000 miles from new, and it is like stepping into a brand new one. Wow. And they're so unloved that there are very few like it. So I thought, even though it's a 2.9, I've got to have this. We've missed another one. I've got a Morris 1100, which I bought well before the 1300 GT. It's the same body. 1966. It's a Mark 1. I like Mark 1s because they are the design and engineering intent, give or take some cost reductions. And this, as I've mentioned many a time, it was the best-selling car in Britain for 10 years. And when it came out, was by far the most advanced small family car in the world. And it's just almost totally overlooked. And yet it played really quite a role in British motoring history, and would have played a bigger role in Europe were it not for the fact that we weren't in the European common market. And so there were very big tariffs on British cars. So it didn't really make much sales headway on mainland Europe, even though it was better than most of what you could buy over there at the time.
What's clear to me in all of this, and we must wrap it up, we are running out of time, it's that clearly you like BL cars and we know why, but you like cars that have a bit of a backstory or something interesting to say about them. It's not purely the way they look or the way they drive. You like the tail, don't you?
And that's a whole other story there, because I know of some other cars that you have owned, a particularly notorious Citroen, I seem to remember, and something else that I also know that you own at the moment, which are very interesting cars with very interesting backstories. But we just haven't got time to talk about them now.
No.
Which is good news, because that means you're going to have to come back on again and tell us about about
all the other stuff.
All the other stuff. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Richard, we must wrap it up there. But thank you so much for coming on. As Andrew says, let's do it again.
Yeah.
To everyone listening and watching, thank you for tuning in, and make sure that you hit the little follow button or the subscribe button wherever you're listening to this or watching this. Richard, thank you again. Let's do it again in a little while.
Thanks.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks a lot.